Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk, sponsored by Inglis and Darley. My name's Bren, and joining me, as per usual, is Tim Rowe. This week, we discuss racing's relationship with politics, a boost for the Caulfield Cup, chat to Godolphin's Andy Makiv about plans post the sale of Crown Lodge, and discuss the role of pacemakers in modern racing. In breeding, the breeze up sales, the sleeping giant of Australian bloodstock, Tron Bolt's family connection, and a reflection on the weanling sales. While in wagering, what will be the impact on racing of greater advertising bans, plus the national tote can't come soon enough. Tim, let's kick off with a mix of racing and politics. Plenty of news this week out of my neck of the woods. Tassie Racing Minister Jane Howlett resigned this week. Comes after the recent instability in Queensland with Tim Mander stepping down pending an inquiry on an electoral issue. It's an interesting one. I mean, the impact or the reliance of racing on politics is significant because obviously, the state governments administer the laws and a lot of the funding agreements that work around racing. When you have a change of racing minister or when you have turmoil within politics, it certainly impacts, what goes on in the racing context. And you can see why some of these racing executives and officials and people on boards, etc., find it, you know, trying to manage that, I guess, manage those relationships is a really key part of a success of a racing jurisdiction, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, I think anytime, and you wrote earlier this week, well worth the read of the article, that the just the loss of time or knowledge when there's a change of minister, even racing industry people or ministers who are or MPs that are attracted to racing, just those intricacies of racing administration, whether it's wagering or the breeding industry or how sales work, and obviously racing, just trying to have a minister who understands all those intricacies and the complexities, I think probably goes a long way to having a successful racing minister in terms of the industry acknowledging a successful racing minister. And so the loss of even Jane Howlett, to my knowledge, or sort of following it from afar and seeing her at different events, that she seemed to have a reasonable handle on the industry. Not perfect, I'm sure, but as a rule, she had probably more idea than certainly some of her Tassie colleagues in Parliament. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a question here: why would a politician take on a racing portfolio? I mean, sure, the champagne and the race days are nice and all that sort of stuff, but it does become intensely political. And obviously, we've seen in Tasmania with the greyhound band issue. There's a couple of points that are made that I guess Jane Howland hadn't been at as many functions because the greyhound issue had become quite political within Tassie. Now you can say that's sort of their own doing or whatever else, but I guess you can understand how that works. And I guess any racing minister that wants to step into that space. Politics in racing is brutal, but politics in politics is more brutal. And so trying to work around that. We're also stepping into an environment, Tim, where it's pretty clear that, the political environment in Australia is becoming much more complex. There's a rise of obviously independent parties or independent movements that's going to change the way. In Tassie, we've got a minority government, and you probably will not be surprised if we see minority governments in other states coming forward, given what we're seeing in the polls at the moment. So, the political implications of what's going on in Australia for racing are significant.
Well, and sort of on that, a lot of these sort of state MPs have got multiple portfolios, and just the tangible outcomes. If you're the minister and you build a new hospital or a school or something, so it's very tangible, and the electorate can see that. Where with racing, it's probably much harder. Even with in New South Wales, for instance, the racing for the regions, new stables and things like that. The different initiatives or infrastructure projects, the wider community doesn't see that, whereas with a hospital, the whole community notices it.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it is a difficult one to sell from a political point of view, but racing is such a significant employer and such a significant industry. And I think maybe, we probably need an approach from I guess lobbying is probably not the right word, but certainly informing Parliament. I know there's Friends of Parliaments groups and that sort of stuff that's being done around Australia where the racing bodies are sort of coming into the Parliament and talking to people. It's happened at a federal level with the breeding and thoroughbred industry. I know that Thoroughbred Breeders Australia led that, but then also there's under over Racing Victoria, and obviously Racing New South Wales have got a very good relationship there. Racing Queensland have got their own some, but then we've got sort of limitations. So, for example, Tas Racing under its constitution can't do any what's determined as lobbying. So it's a complex one, Tim, and one we'll continue to follow. And we'll move on now to the Caulfield Cup announcing this week a boost in prize money to $6 million. It's probably a good one for the Caulfield Cup. I guess its profile may have probably dipped a little bit, certainly with the Everest being held mainly on the same day, not always, but mainly on the same day as the Caulfield Cup. It's probably, affected the profile of that race. What does $1 million do to the Caulfield Cup in terms of profile, Tim?
Well, they're more it's the bottom half of the field or connections to the bottom half of the field will get 60,000. So I guess, the if we'd all love to have a horse good enough to go in a Caulfield Cup or a Melbourne Cup and Cox Plate, but it also costs a lot of money to enter into those races. So I guess it's a way of giving some of that money back, going, "You know what? We'll have a crack at this race and we'll pay up." And the connection sort of, if things don't go right during carnival, you don't manage to finish in the first half, you haven't, wasted not wasted, but you've out of pocket significant, probably six figures. That way you've got some back, and that's sort of the way I read what they've done with the race and trying to attract more international runners as well with ballot free races in Europe. One was run this week at Royal Ascot, and it's going to be a few more at Goodwood and in Ireland, the Curragh and things like that, trying to boost international participation.
Don't get me started about winning in races, Tim. We'll be here all day. I'm not a fan of winning in races and handicap because you change the nature of the way that the handicap works. And anyway, that's my pet peeve. That one of the wins. I'll leave it alone for now. But I feel like we've got to be careful about how we manage our handicaps because the handicap is actually a really key part of that. Anyway, just moving on now, Tim. To probably the biggest story broke late last week. We kind of knew it was going to happen anyway, but Godolphin had sold Crown Lodge to Racing New South Wales, and then Racing New South Wales have subsequently come to an agreement with Kieran Maher for him to move his pretty much entire Sydney operations, with the exception of some of his the farm he's got out the road, Bob's Farm, wherever it's called out at north of Sydney, to basically have his operations within that. I mean, the first question around this, Tim, before we chatted to Andy Makiv around this the managing director of Godolphin Australia. We'll go to that interview in a minute, but before we get to that, the impacts for Kieran Maher, the impacts for Bong Bong Farm, the impacts on Leilani Lodge. Talk us through those and what we can see, what we're likely to see happen over the next sort of 3 or 4 months around those sort of, factors.
Well, firstly, for Kieran Maher and his footprint in New South Wales, I think it makes perfect sense to consolidate, have 125, 130 horses at the Warwick Farm in one base. He's going to keep Bob's Farm, which is his beach facility, sort of north of Newcastle, and vacate Bong Bong Farm. And I guess logistically, it's already, as we know, a massive operation, and he's got a multiple, at least three bases in Victoria with Ballarat, Cranbourne, and Fingal. Just trying to keep on top of that, having horses or the majority of horses at Warwick Farm, I think logistically will make the exercise a lot easier. Bong Bong, built by Paul Fudge, state-of-the-art sort of facility. It wasn't flawless, so to speak, but I think a big issue talking to not Kieran, but other people who sort of know the place well, it's in a wealthy area, Southern Highlands, attracting staff or rent. Rents are quite high in that area, Southern Highlands. So just attracting enough staff when you've got 80 or 100 horses on the place, I think makes it quite difficult. And from here, what Racing New South Wales do with it, I'm not sure, given there wasn't a horse on it for sort of 2 years before Kieran moved in there. So trying to find a trainer that's willing to take it on, with the scale is not going to be easy. So it'll be interesting to see what Racing New South Wales do with that asset. And then onto Leilani Lodge, again, I can't blame Kieran for relinquishing the lease on that, but understandably, I would say the ATC are a little bit peeved at that. They've invested money with Kieran to upgrade Leilani Lodge, and now they don't have a tenant. Sort of, it'll be another few months, call for expressions of interest and things like that to try and get a trainer in there. I'm sure there'll be no shortage of applicants, but, they probably could have had a trainer in there last year if it wasn't Kieran, and, that's revenue that lost to the industry. But again, I can't blame Kieran for that. If I was in his position, I'd take Crown Lodge as well.
Yeah, it does pay. It's kind of an interesting one when you've got the ATC as a tenant losing out for someone who's going to Racing New South Wales as a tenant, and puts the conversation around Racing New South Wales and ATC in the spotlight. And I just on that, Tim, just a quick update around that story. That the court case, I believe, or the court decision will be handed down in that aspect on Friday. So keep an eye out for that on the straight as well. Staying on the sort of that issue and broader Crown Lodge stuff. Tim, you chatted to Andy Makiv late last week. We've recorded for the podcast. Give us a bit of context around the decision making and what I guess Godolphin and Darley's priorities are going forward.
I've been told there was developer interest, but what was the Godolphins thinking behind going, well, with Racing New South Wales, but keeping it within the racing industry, presumably for possibly less money?
Well, I wouldn't say it's less money, firstly.
Yep.
The process was run by Godolphin and Co., and it was a very competitive process. There was some interest from a number of parties, some developer interest, but ultimately it was a competitive process, and Racing New South Wales, ultimately won the day fairly and squarely. So there was, at the end of the day, we're also a business that trying to attract the best price we can, and that's effectively where we finished up. So it's a very prized possession for the racing industry. So Racing New South Wales, I suspect, recognised that as well. So they won the day in a very competitive process. So delighted for them. Delighted that the property does stay within the racing industry. I think it's as good a racing site as there is certainly in metropolitan Sydney. So I'm very pleased for Racing New South Wales, pleased for racing in that state, and pleased for the new tenant, who reports seem to think that it's Karen Maher. So good luck to them, and I think it'll be a great site for many years to come.
Can you say, I didn't question without notice, but was there other racing interested parties that sort of expressed an interest in it?
There were some racing people that had a walk through and had a look and showed interest from racing investor people that have trainers through to some of the leading trainers had a good look at it. But ultimately, it's a site that is quite large. It's a site that comes with a lot of housing as well. So it's a site that's got a sizable price tag on it. So ultimately, it was Racing New South Wales, as I said, that won the competitive process at the end.
Obviously, whatever it's sold for is a important revenue stream or important amount of capital back into the Godolphin coffers. Could we see that sort of reinvested in your bloodstock division, or how within the industry, I guess?
The proceeds will form part of broader business planning. They're trust assets at the end of the day, these properties. So, there's a trust and there's trustees that will look at these things. So, what I will say is Godolphin continues to invest significantly in Australia across racing, upwards of 200 horses. We've got a big breeding operation, big stallion operation, international shuttle stallion operation. We invest a lot in our farms and our people. So certainly there's a lot of investment that goes into that. There's some things that we'd like to do on the farms that Northwood Park was developed 20 years ago. Kelvinside was developed 20 plus years ago, and Woodlands is an aging site as well. So there's certainly some investment and things we can do on the farms to get things back up to speed. So we certainly feel that we invest strongly in this industry here in Australia.
Yeah. And Osborne Park's another important, very well known racing piece of infrastructure that you own near Hawkesbury there. How's that being used at the moment, or what's its future?
We at this point we're looking to retain that asset. It's obviously quite a unique asset that took a lot of time, effort and cost in building. So it's an important property for us at this point. We are going through at the moment what we will do with it, whether we lease it, whether we use it in some capacity. So at the moment we're retaining it as in our ownership, and what its future will look like we'll be able to tell you in a few months. So we're just doing some work around leasing and or using it in some other way.
Okay. Is there any other Godolphin Australia assets that possibly could hit the market or not at the moment?
No. We've got the three major farms that are all used to develop our young horses, run our stallion business, and break our horses in. So we're certainly using those three farms. So nothing else to be offloaded in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, interesting interview with Andy there, sort of going through the details. Yeah, it was good with his time, and good to be able to sort of get a bit of more context around, there was probably this time last year, there was a lot of questions about what Godolphin's future might be in Australia, Tim, and I don't think you can doubt where they're sit at the moment, with the exception of the dispersal of Crown Lodge, as Andy puts it out there, there's plenty of reasons to be optimistic. They've got a lot of good horses. They've got arguably one of the best stallion rosters in the land at the moment, and things are going quite well for them, aren't they?
Sure, yeah, no, I wanna be in, Godolphin's Australian books should look pretty healthy the next couple of years at least, so which is good for the industry, I think.
Sticking with Godolphin, and big result at Royal Ascot overnight, Tim. Ombudsman winning dominating the Prince of Wales at stakes. He's a freak, that horse, but something that triggered a bit of a conversation between us this morning, which I thought I'd bring into the context of this podcast, was, I guess, the use of pacemakers in racing. And I guess, given some context last week in the Q22, there was a fair bit of, I guess, criticism sort of directed to the way that race was run and that the horse in front was able to dominate and win quite significantly. Was it Royal Supremacy? Is that the name of the horse, wasn't it? I'm trying to think that was the name of the horse. Yes. I was there, so I should remember it. That, I guess there's different types of, there's front runners and there's pacemakers, Tim. Is there a fine line between those two? And I know you're, very much an opponent to introduction of pacemakers into races in Australia.
Yes, and first of all, I think this podcast would be a hell of a lot better if we recorded it live from Royal Ascot next year, but anyway, we'll see how we go. Yeah, I'm anti pacemakers, nothing against Ombudsman, great horse. I just I think racing's more than, you know, every horse. It's not about every horse getting its chance or being suited by the tempo. That is racing, and punting is different tracks or different tempos, set up different options, which is why, at Ascot you might bet back Ombudsman because it's a big track and then he goes somewhere else, or, you know, better example is, half yours at Royal Supremacy or whatever. Ipswich is this weekend, very tight track, you might back on paces, and then you go to Eagle Farm and, bigger track, should be able to make ground. I think that's part of it. And you put, jockeys that are the better jockeys. I know they're all good jockeys who were riding that race last Saturday, but, you factor that into your bets, or if you're an owner or a trainer, what jockeys you want on because they're good at judging pace or tempo or making split-second decisions about making early moves and things like that. I know it didn't happen last weekend, but that's just part of it, and I think it's better for racing rather than just pacemakers going, 15 lengths in front and carving it and, setting it up for one or two horses.
Yeah, I think probably what it does take away from it, the pacemaker, is the ability for jockeys to judge the pace. They know it's going to be a genuine pace, so they know what they're doing. You can imagine the jockeys that were sitting back on those three main chances in that race last night. We're all sitting back going, "Well, we know the pace is going to happen. When we know with a fair degree of certainty that the two horses that are going out at hammer and tong in front are going to come back to us." And so, it does take that element out of it. I would like to see more pace in Australian weight for age races as a rule, because I think it produces better horses and better ratings. But I'm sure better minds than me are happy to debate me around that one. Tim, you wanted to just also relay that the pacemaker thing doesn't always work out the way you think it is. So was it when you were at Goodwood last year, I think a Field of Gold was well back to win the race, and then instead it was the pacemaker that bobbed at very large odds.
Yeah, Curate, I think his name was. Yeah, this went down to the amount of yards, saw the Field of Gold in the Sussex Stakes. This is the next champion supposedly, and yeah, the 150 to 1 chance held on. Field of Gold actually missed a place that day, so it does. I'm not saying that pacemakers can't win; they obviously can, but I think punters should be able to factor that in. Is this horse is trying or going to go it's suited by going fast, but not so fast it's just setting up for another runner.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we want good racing. That's a key part of it, but we also want racing that produces good results. So that's always the things we were trying to look at. The following segment is brought to you by Inglis. Inglis, Australia's leading thoroughbred auctioneer and one of the most respected names in the global horse racing and breeding, is excited to announce the return of the Inglis Internship Program, for which applications are now open. The Inglis Internship is a full-time position that provides the successful candidate the chance to gain an in-depth insight and understanding of all facets of the racing and breeding industries across the entire Inglis business. The role will see the successful applicants spend time in each of the major divisions of the Inglis organisation, predominantly in the bloodstock team, but with opportunities through the likes of the marketing, English digital, English rural property teams in both the Sydney and Melbourne offices. To apply for the English internship, send a current CV with appropriate references and a cover letter explaining why you feel you are a worthy candidate to internship@inglis.com.au. Tim, moving on now to breeding and bloodstock. It's probably a quieter time of year, I suppose. We've moved beyond the majority of the sales. We've still got a weanling sale to go in New Zealand. I think we've got a Perth yearling sale, winter sale on this week. So there's always things going on, plus the regular digital sales that we have. I was having a chat to Henry Field from Newgate after the running of the JJ Atkins last week and the win of Tron Bolt in that race. I think he's the first, I'm pretty sure he's the first Group 1 winning 2-year-old graduate of a breeze up sale in Australia. I'll triple check that, but I'm pretty sure he was. But it does probably highlight the virtues of those breeze up sales, and that perhaps better horses are starting to come through. Those sales both on the English sale in Sydney, the Magic Millions one at the Gold Coast, and obviously we've seen the New Zealand sale, the Ready to Run sale, produce some great results as well.
Yeah, obviously it's a very good year for Inglis this year. Hard Kick won the Talon Dirt earlier this year and was favourite for the Blue Diamond, and they didn't run him much. Anyway, that didn't help my bank account. But anyway, he's a very nice horse. Lloyd Kennewell had a Rubik called Mbube, is that how you say it? The one at Sandown on Saturday as well. It's just I think it's probably twofold. The connections vendors and owners have seen that there's a platform to be able to sell nice horses to mostly Asia, and that's probably led. And now domestically, people are having to take notice as well that there's some good horses there, and that'll lead to greater competition. Certainly in English, and depending what Magic Millions do, and certainly New Zealand. There's always a lot of nice horses come out of that sale. It is particularly New Zealand, as we know, a trading export market. So I expect probably all three, certainly, most of the sales to be very strong this year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of it. I guess the confidence is that, I mean, I guess, the there was great encouragement for that sale because obviously no sales, because obviously they get the sales companies get another, I guess, grab of the commission opportunity, I suppose, through that to sell horses through there. But if better horses come through there, and I think also horses that probably don't quite fit the profile, from your conversations with Kelly Skillicorn, he said that Tron Bolt was just going through a bit of a funny stage when he was going through Easter and probably wasn't, looking as good as he probably could have been. But that had sold him, as a weanling, and then again, as a 2-year-old breeze up horse, like he looked well, literally almost looked $1,000,000 when he was sold. So it's interesting how those things work out, Tim. And I think there's no set formula. Some horses are better suited in that situation. I think what the insight I sort of gleaned from talking to a couple of people over the weekend, and you'll probably be the same, is that there's a lot more faith being put in the people who are preparing these breeze up horses. And I guess the cliche is that if you get a breeze up horse, they're very fired up and they've been through a program. You kind of have to put them out in the paddock and settle them down again and sort of bring them back. But the feeling is now that these horses are much better prepared to sort of have a really strong 2-year-old campaign.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. That's probably why there's been some nice horses get to the races pretty quickly. Is that the trainers have had to re-educate them. They're not going to over race or anything like that, or not too many of them, because they've been jazzed up to run 200 metres in quick time. I think the market's evolved where time's important, still sells well, but it's how they do it. You can run, say, high 10s or early 11s, and do it easily and move well, as opposed to a horse that might break 10 for 200 metres, but they've used all their energy and maybe possibly break down. It's just one of those. It's a balancing act, but there seems to be the market, the vendors are going very well, and we've spoken previously. I certainly have. The vendors that get a reputation for producing nice horses and educating them, they tend to sell well, sort of above other. You've got to earn that reputation, but that's a big selling point of these 2-year-old sales as well, as who's educated the horse.
Yeah, I think Tron Bolt ran 10:09 for his breeze up, which is pretty slick. I think he was one of the fastest ones and ahead of that sale. So he certainly promises to be a very a player in those 3-year-old features moving forward, and looks like a horse that might line improve at 3, which is good. And sort of looking back through his pedigree, I discovered it on the weekend, went back through a few generations and found a very familiar name, Fanfreluche, who's a very influential Canadian mare whose descendants in Australia include Flying Spur in Costa del Lago, Russian Revolution, Home Affairs. I think there's 8 Group 1 winners, Australian Group 1 winners, and 20 Group 1 winners, and all that are descended from her. But the story behind her is a quite extraordinary story. So have a look at Run the Numbers this week. I sort of delved into it a little bit, but she was kidnapped in 1977, disappeared for 5 months. No one knew where she was, turned up in a panic 200 miles away. They worked out it was her eventually. She had a secretariat cult, carrying a secretariat cult at that stage, and then went on, produced, I think, 18 foals in all. 16 were winners, I think. And the last of those foals that she had, I think, in 1990, ended up being the great-great-granddam of Tron Bolt. So it's interesting how these stories come through, Tim. Look at the other end of the scale in terms of, we talked about the 2-year-old sales, but look at the weanling sales. We obviously had the Great Southern sale last week. We've got the New Zealand weanling sale next week as well. But what did you make out of the weanling season in Australia, Tim? It seemed to be some green shoots there. Obviously, we saw a big result for the, for the relation to the Oaks winner.
Fireball.
Yeah, Fem Fireball. Yeah, yep, that's Fireball. Fem Fireball, the Animo. Yulong obviously keen to secure that family, and a great result there for Three Bridges and the people who invested in that. But what did you see? Sort of, the highlight results can obscure some other things. But what'd you take out of it?
I just think that maybe I'm pessimistic, but just the strength of the market across all 3 sales, Gold Coast and in Sydney for Inglis and Great Southern, just continued right through for quality horses, clearly that vetted quite well. They must, by nature, well, I guess, where if you're in racing, you're a punter to some degree, and that, there just must be, there's that confidence that next year they're going to be able to resell those horses. There's some, mate, Simon Miller bought a few I think at all 3 sales. He keeps them to race. There's lots of different angles, and it just seemed to be much stronger than what I was expecting. And I think also breeders recognise that either after after the Sydney sale or even before that, where they presented some nice horses to the weanling market to, generate cash flow, and by and large, they got well rewarded, I thought.
Yeah, it's interesting one. Certainly a couple of people we spoke to from a buying perspective were quite frustrated that they couldn't get their hands on the horses they thought at the price they want. But it does give a bit of an inkling for next year that there's still confidence that, despite all the other broader things happening across the world, that there's still confidence the yearling market will be in strong. So those waiting for a correction in the yearling market, the weanling market might indicate that might be the case next year. The following segment is brought to you by Darley. The Darley roster is one of the most real talking points this season, and the numbers show why. New for 2026 are Tentaris and Observer, 2 exciting additions to a 16-strong roster. Across the group, you're looking at 43 Group 1 wins, 81 Group wins, 87 stakes wins, 12 champion titles, and 8 race or track records broken. And when you're a breeder, that's exactly what you want. Horses with race records, the quality and the substance to give you confidence. Go to darley.com.au for more details. Finally, Tim, as always, we round off in the wagering world, and there's an article up in the Straight today about I've gone through in detail the proposals around the wagering advertising bans from the federal government, but specifically around its impacts on racing, and I guess the carve-out, as we've spoken about, the term that's been used for racing. They're pretty explicit, actually, the carve-outs, which is probably a positive for racing in some regards, albeit sort of talking to a few people, there's probably a few questions around a couple of things which haven't been absolutely clarified, but it is a big, significant amount of change here. We've heard about these changes, and there's a lot of people who have felt that the wagering advertising changes need to go further and there need to be a blanket ban on wagering advertising. Look, beyond that, I think racing can move forward with some confidence that its interests will be represented here. I don't think there's anything that's going to jump out and scare them there, apart from the fact that obviously there's a reliance on sports betting through POX revenue, which is a bit of a knock-on effect, which racing will have to adapt to. But it appears it's play on for wagering media companies and the racing bodies and the race clubs that take sponsorships from wagering companies. We've obviously seen that's been a big factor in the last 10 years, Tim, and a lot of money for clubs is generated out of there. So you get the feeling that's probably, racing's probably done okay out of what we've seen, from what's been exposed so far.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. What's going to be interesting is, these big corporates have been very smart and obviously spent a lot of money on marketing and promotions and things like that, using sport and the football codes and cricket to promote their services and businesses. Whether their budgets will just drop dramatically, marketing, or whether they get smarter and devote more to racing, how they use the carve outs to their advantage and hopefully to racing's.
Yeah, and I think probably the other thing to mention too is that sports betting is seen as a gateway to racing betting as well. And that, there's been anecdotal evidence and I think evidence produced from some of the big wagering providers that, people who start out in sports betting do end up betting on racing. So probably some thinking to be done there around the impact of that and what that may look like. But I think from a legislative point of view, I mean, the reality is the fines for this are quite significant. It's up to $1.5 million per breach, Tim. So it's not something that the wagering companies want to get wrong. But I think racing will do okay out of it, but it'll be interesting to see, when the rubber hits the road, what it looks like. The other one I want to mention, Tim, where let's have a look at the date. 13 days out from Gil McLaughlin's self-imposed July 1st deadline for the establishment of national tote, and we're yet to hear what's going on with that. There is a sense that perhaps it's not going to hit the absolute deadline on that, and TAB have obviously had some, what's the best way to put it, some other priorities around the Austrac stuff going on as well. I wonder if the national tote would solve the problem of operating on more than 24 runners in a race, Tim. This is an old bugbear that's gone back for many generations, but we saw it raise its head on Tuesday night in the King Charles Stakes, where it's had both Asfour and Overpass in the race. Great Australian interest, but had 27 starters, I remember, maybe 26. Anyway, more than 24. So therefore, the tote couldn't field on it, which they can't do it on a few of these races at Royal Ascot beyond that. I wonder if that'll solve that problem, Tim. And if it has solved that problem, does that change the VRC's mind around how many horses can run the Melbourne Cup? Albeit they've got to find some more barriers.
Well, on the tote, you would think it'd be pretty simple, but I don't think the Melbourne Cup needs any more runners. 24's enough opportunity for most people. It's a long tail. There's a lot of 100 to 1 plus chances anyway. Yes, you want to have a runner, but I don't think it needs to go any more than 24. And I don't think we need emergencies because in the Melbourne Cup case, because you get the ones, there's so many, no race has more than once a year punters in the Melbourne Cup. And they're backing emergencies, trying to explain A, deductions, or B, why their horse didn't run. It's just not worth the effort, I don't think. So in that case, I can understand not having emergencies. Whether that's the logic behind their decision, I'm not sure, but that's what I have been told in the past. But you would think for Royal Ascot and other meetings like that, they could easily service 24 plus fields, and even in their results service, they can't. Look, I wake up and okay, who won last night? They can only present the results for the races that are less than 24 horses or fewer than 24 horses. So it's just, little technical things like that you'd think would be relatively easily overcome.
Especially since Whirlpool can operate on that.
Yeah.
Whirlpool can operate beyond 24, and that's the key. Whirlpool's supposed to be the key to everything and how we're going to work out. It was funny you mentioned about numbers beyond that. I was having a look at a few of the numbers last night. They look like Tats Lotto numbers, the winners, 26 and 28, and all these horses winning last night at the saddle class. That's what makes Royal Ascot quite a unique event, because the size of the fields and all that type of stuff. And I think it's an interesting one thinking forward. Maybe a solution might come in place, but we'll have to wait and see what happens with the national tote when it happens. Any other shout outs or anything else, Tim, you want to sort of raise before we head off?
No, I don't think so today. I think I've got my pacemakers rant in there. So no, that's about it.
Excellent, no props. Thanks for joining us on Straight Talk, brought to you by our fabulous sponsors, Darley and Inglis. Don't forget to give us a rating when you're listening to our podcast. Be sure to subscribe. Check out sign up to as a newsletter reader for the Straight. Make sure you do that. But also, if you really want to get access to all our content, make sure you have a look at our membership options at $19 per month and $199 per year. Might be a little discount coming up on that, so maybe you wait a couple of days and we might be able to do a couple of favours for our good Straight Talk listeners to do them a bit of a discount at the end of financial year. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it as always, and we'll talk to you again next week.